Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yes? All right. Well, welcome. This is a wonderful turnout. We're really, really glad to have so many people from our area interested in having a conversation about some really important issues. My name is Rosemary Powers, and tonight I'm deciding I'm going to represent Currents of Justice for Peace. I think I probably belong to all the groups sponsoring tonight, but even so, that's the one, a small organizing group of folks in LeGrand and Union County that try to do that, be Currents of Justice for Peace. The title of our conversation tonight is, Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon? A Hidden History. So before we move into that, I'd like to thank the local co-sponsoring organizations and indicate also the major sponsors for the event. You may have seen these on the flyer that we had out, but just to recognize people who put work into tonight, Oregon Rural Action, the EOU Multicultural Center, Racial Justice of Eastern Oregon, Currents of Justice for Peace, Student Club Mission for Environmental and Social Awareness, the Black Student Union, and the Student Council for Multicultural Affairs. We thank Eastern Oregon University for making the space available to us. And tonight's program is part of a tour of 6 rural and small town Oregon communities, including Josephine, Lane, Polk, Union, Crook, and Columbia counties. And the tour is sponsored by the Rural Organizing Project and by Oregon Humanities. Just a bit about them so you know who the sponsors are. The Rural Organizing Project is a network of over 50 autonomous, all volunteer groups across the state working together for human dignity and justice. The Rural Organizing Project's mission is to advocate and advance democracy in rural, frontier, and small-town Oregon. So we're one of those spots. The Oregon Humanities is a statewide nonprofit organization that connects Oregonians to ideas that change lives and transform communities. Oregon Humanities offers conversation projects to communities across the state to promote thoughtful discussions about important ideas. Oregon Humanities will fund Conversation Project programs throughout the state this year, thanks to the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Oregon Cultural Trust, and contributions from individuals. We, though, also will accept any donations that you feel that you can make tonight to support this event. There's a green box out in the hallway out there, and you can share anything that you're able to that will help the project as well to meet its expenses. And before we start, I want to be sure that everyone has a participation evaluation form. Some of you don't have seats yet, maybe, but we'll make sure you get those. And then return that to me at the end of the program. I'll be up here at the front. Also, you can find restrooms in this building. If I remember how, you kind of go down the hall a little bit this way and then to the right. You'll kind of find it down there. Also, we have those cell phone things that go off and we forget to turn them off. So if you would do that or put it on a vibrate or some way you need to have somebody reach you perhaps, but do turn those off, please. And finally, my students from SOC 204 and SOC 306 are getting some extra special love and care for coming tonight and joining us. So be sure to sign in with me. The sign-in sheet's up here near the front, and you can find me later if you don't see it there. So, Walidah, Imarisha, who's with us tonight, is an educator, a poet, an organizer, and a writer. She's a public scholar with Oregon Humanities Conversation Project, and she's toured Oregon for 5 years doing programs on Oregon Black history, alternatives to incarceration, and the history of hip-hop. She teaches at Portland State University's Black Studies Department. She's editor of Octavia's Brood, science fiction stories from social justice movements, which I can hardly wait to read. She also is the author of the nonfiction book focused on criminal justice issues, Angels with Dirty Faces, 3 Stories of Crime, Prison, and Redemption, another book I'm anxious to read as well. So the format of tonight's conversation, and she will let you know more detail about it, it includes a 90-minute interactive presentation with Walidah Imarisha, and then a 30-minute facilitated conversation where we'll talk in smaller groups and discuss the information we've learned with our neighbors. This will be facilitated by community members and Eastern Oregon University students. Those folks will be Garrett Young from the Black Student Union, Austin Saunders from Currents for Justice for Peace, and Corey Brewster from Oregon Rural Action. So with that, thank you all for coming out tonight, and welcome Walidah Imarisha.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me all right? Yes? Folks in the back, you're cool? All right, great. So we have a lot of co-sponsors. I want to say their names again because, I'm up here, but they're the folks who actually did the work to make all of this happen, including getting all of y'all in the room. So I'd like to thank Oregon Rural Action, Currents of Justice for Peace, Eastern Oregon University's Multicultural Center, the Black Student Union, Mission for Environmental and Social Awareness, and the Student Council for Multicultural Affairs. I also want to thank Rural Organizing Project and Oregon Humanities. This is actually the second year that I have done this tour with them, traveling around doing this program in rural communities. And I greatly enjoy doing it, especially in collaboration with Rural Organizing Project, because they do the piece after mine that says, okay, we've talked about this large history, we've talked about the current landscape, what does that mean for us here? What can we actually do? And I think that piece is incredibly powerful, the organizing on the ground. So I'm so glad that y'all get to do that. I also want to thank the folks who have volunteered to do security here from your community, and very much want to thank the folks that came with me to do security and have been traveling with me, Ajamu, Tiernan, and Ari. And the reason I have to do I have to have security travel with me is because there have been a lot of issues around white supremacists and right-wing reactionaries. So in the past, I've had neo-Nazis show up to disrupt my event and to threaten me. I've had many more threats of disruption and physical harm. And just on this tour, just last week, just a few days ago in Cottage Grove, we actually had reactionaries show up and surveil participants, threaten them with physical violence, and horrifically harass them as well. So this, having these conversations, it's not, oftentimes folks say, well, that's really interesting, but why are you bringing up things that are, so long ago and so unimportant to today? And clearly, these conversations around the history of race and identity and power are still very much relevant. And so I am incredibly thankful to the security that comes with me, because I literally would not be able to be here without their support and without them coming. So thank you all for doing that. I am here to talk about my program, Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon? A Hidden History, which is looking at the history of race, identity, and power in Oregon and also in the larger nation. This is Oregon Black history, which is also Oregon history, because Oregon Black history is Oregon history, just like the history of people of color is the history of this country. And we actually can't begin to understand the communities, the world we live in without understanding this history. So this is part of Oregon Humanities Conversation Project. So the goal is for y'all to have conversation and dialogue. It's not the I will lecture at you for an hour and a half project, which would be a terrible name to start with. So I'd love for y'all to start actually having conversations now. So what I would love is for you to find someone that you do not know and each just take 1 minute and say your name and why you came here today. So you just take 1 minute each, I'm gonna time y'all, and say your name and why you came to the event today. So break. So wrap up that thought. We're going to come back to the larger group. This is not the last time you get to talk to your new friend, I promise. If you want, obviously, you don't have to. I hope you want to. I'm sure you met very nice people. Anyway, so the layout for my portion of the program is we are going to engage with the Oregon Black History timeline that I've created, and a little bit more about the timeline in just a few minutes. We're actually going to tour the timeline in pairs, which is part of why you made a new friend. So if you came alone, bam, now you have a friend. If you brought a friend and you want your old friend, that's fine too. Just have a friend, old or new, it's fine. So you're going to tour that in pairs for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to come back together and have some very large group conversations around the context for this history. And then the last piece is we are going to connect the current racial disparities in Oregon to this past. So if you are someone who needs to know what's coming, now you know, and so we can just roll right into it. So the Oregon Black History Timeline, you might have seen it in the hallway on your way in, is a tool that I developed to have these conversations around this history. So a few disclaimers on it. It is by no means a comprehensive timeline. I've got about 35 slides here today. In its entirety right now, it's about 70 slides. I just keep keep adding slides. People are like, stop with the slides. I'm like, I can't stop with the slides. Even with 70 slides, it is by no means comprehensive. It is some key moments in history that I think get to answering this question and get to allowing us to have conversations around the history of race, identity, and power in Oregon and in the nation. So my area of scholarship and focus is Black history, and so the timeline focuses on Black history. There are a few slides from other communities of color so that you can compare and contrast the experiences, but it's incredibly important to learn those specific histories, not to generalize, right? Even though the same forces were shaping different communities of color, the reactions in those communities, how it manifested, the resistance and the resilience of those communities are unique and should be treated and honored as such. So don't go around and be like, yeah, I heard Walidah, she did this hour-and-a-half thing, so it's cool. I don't need to learn about brown people anymore. I know. Don't do that. Don't use me like that, y'all. A few other disclaimers. For folks especially who haven't encountered this information before, they can find some of the images and the information shocking and disturbing. It's obviously not there for shock value. It is there because this is the real history of people in this community, and there are folks who are carrying the weight of this history every single day in your community. And if you have had the privilege to not have to deal with this history or the repercussions of it, then that is a huge privilege. And my understanding of community is if one of us is carrying a burden, then we're all carrying that burden until we're able to move forward. So this is not a library, so I want y'all, when you're touring with your partner, to actually talk to them as you go through the timeline. That means you probably won't necessarily read every single word on every single slide in 15 minutes. That's all right. The goal is really to have conversation and dialogue. When we come back together, I'll be putting it into context. I will also be giving you access to the timeline. So sometimes folks are furiously trying to take notes on every single slide. You don't have to do that. You will have access to the timeline in 2 different formats. So you can just really be present with your partner and tour the timeline, really focus on conversations. So touring the timeline, there are 3 different ways to do it. So one, as you probably noticed, as I said, it's actually hung up in the hallway. So it starts on this wall and then loops around to the closest wall. So you can physically get up and tour the timeline with your partner if you would like to do that. Obviously, please don't all start at the beginning of the timeline. You will not get through it, right? So jump in the middle. I tried to space it out so there's more room. If you're like, look, Walidah, it's been a long day. I don't want to walk around. I didn't come for that. That's cool. I'm going to be showing the same timeline overhead. So you and your partner can, sit next to each other and talk as the slides go through. It's on a PowerPoint timer. If you've used PowerPoint, you know PowerPoint does what PowerPoint wants to do. So it's on a timer. You can't control it. I can't control it at this point. No one can control it. So you really probably won't get to see every word. But lastly, I have 4 binders with the same timeline in them. So I ask that you give priority to these binders to folks who have mobility or vision concerns so that we make sure that this is accessible to everyone. And I ask that you form slightly larger groups around the binders, so groups of 4 or so. But after we take maybe a minute, when I say break, let people who need the binders get them first. Then it's first come, first serve on the binders, on any that are left. So those are the 3 ways to tour the timeline. You can physically get up with your partner and walk through the timeline, not all starting at the chronological beginning. You can sit and watch the timeline overhead, or you can form groups of 4 or so around one of the 4 binders, giving priority to folks who have mobility and vision concerns. And again, we're going to do this for about 15 minutes. Are there any questions about this piece of the program? No? Great. So you can break. I will start the PowerPoint in about 30 seconds to give folks space to clear out if you're going to stand up. If you need a binder, please raise your hand and let me know, and I will get you a binder. So. Are there any folks who need binders? Do you need a binder? Is that what the hand is? Okay. You want? Okay. We still have 3 more binders if anyone wants a binder. Folks in the back, anybody? Yeah. Feel like that professor in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Bueller, binder, binder.
Only like a tenth of the room was laughing about that.
Fun. But please feel free to keep talking. It's not a movie theater, so keep talking. So we're about halfway done in terms of time, just if you are reading a book, but please keep talking just as much. We've got about 5 minutes, just in case. Let's have just 5 minutes. Keep talking. Got another minute or so to start to wrap up. So the lights are going to come on. Get ready. Brace yourself. Good Lord. So we're going to come on back together. I'm going to stand over here so I'm not blinded by the light. So first I wanted to give you all access to the timeline, as I said that I would. So I have made the timeline into a YouTube video. So if you just look up Oregon Black History Timeline, either on Google or YouTube or, you know, what other search engine is popping. Search engines aren't popping. I'm going to move on. So just look it up, and this will be the first video that comes up. It's about 50 slides. And there's an audio commentary by me giving some context. So if you want more me, there's more me. If you don't, hit the mute. Oregon Black History Timeline, and this will be the first video that comes up. Oregon Humanities Magazine printed an excerpt of the timeline in their 2013 summer issue. So the section is called A Hidden History, which is the subtitle of my program. So if you just look up A Hidden History, Oregon Humanities Magazine, this will be the link that pops up. If you scroll down, there'll be a PDF you can read online or also download with the excerpt as well as a short article I wrote. So those are the two ways to find it: Oregon Black History Timeline as a video, A Hidden History, Oregon Humanities Magazine as a PDF. So first I'd like to ask, how many folks went through some sort of K through 12 public school here in Oregon? Can you raise your hand? Oh, that is a sizable number. And how many of y'all learned this history around race in Oregon in your K through 12 public school? There's this. So unfortunately, that is a lay of the land. I've done this program for 5 years. I've toured, done it hundreds of times with thousands of folks all across the state. I've asked that question every single time. And I can probably count on two hands how many people say that they learn this information in any sort of organized fashion. And that's because their teacher went off curriculum. So this is not something that has been part of mandated Oregon public school curriculum. And this is not something that is part of mandated Oregon public school curriculum. I, in fact, did a presentation a couple years ago to mostly public school teachers and public school administrators, and I asked them how many of them had known before they came some of these key moments of Oregon's racial history, and 80% of them said that they had had no idea about some of the most foundational pieces of Oregon history around race. And so this is the teachers. So obviously, if the teachers don't have the information, the students can't get the information. So I'd love to just get some pieces of the timeline that stood out to folks, things that were new information. If anyone wants to share something that stood out, something that was new information, if you maybe want to stand up and make sure you're using your projection voice, that would be great. Yes?
Yeah, but I knew a little bit about Albina, but I did not know all the details about how much of the community that had been pushed aside for highways, and I knew about that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Albina is the area in Portland that is considered to be the heart of the Black community, and that is because of brutal segregation. Well, it's the only place that Black folks were allowed to buy or rent in Portland, up until quite recently, in fact. And it was the Black community that made it the heart of the Black community. But I think that it's important to note that. There's a great article by PSU professor Karen Gibson that talks more about Albina called Bleeding Albina. And it's a really amazing article and resource. She's an urban planning person. You know what I'm saying. So that's a great piece around that. Yeah. Yes?
The timeline in 1922 mentioned Governor Pierce from here. The library at UOU was named after him. Not only was he supported by the Klan very strongly, but he had been a member of the Klan. In 1999, there was a book published called Inside the Labyrinth, and it was published, and it was the only existing narrative of the Ku Klux Klan. We were right from here on the ground.
Absolutely. I think that this is very relevant information, and there's been new scholarship that in fact shows that Walter Pierce was a member of the Klan from LeGrand, and he became governor, right? And I think there are many racial myths that we tell ourselves in America, and I think the Klan is a useful kind of thing to look at because it sort of encapsulates so many of those racial myths. So the myths we tell about the Klan is that it was a fringe extremist organization located in the South, that it was relatively small numbers, that it was not formally educated working class Southern white men, and that it died out, right? None of those things are true, right? The Klan actually is still incredibly active to this day. So right at this moment, there are over 100 active Klan chapters in this country. I don't know if folks heard about the Klan rally that happened in Anaheim, California just a few weeks ago, where a Klan member stabbed 3 counter-protesters who were protesting the Klan. And the protesters went to prison, not the Klansmen who stabbed them, because the police said it was self-defense. So the Klan is certainly not something that's dead and gone, right? It's something that's very much present today. At its height, the Klan was never a fringe organization. The Klan sat at the heart of the fabric of this country. So at its height, the Klan had 15% of eligible Americans as card-carrying members of the Ku Klux Klan. And eligible Americans meant white men, because that's all they wanted. So 15% of white men in this country were card-carrying members of the Ku Klux Klan. Oregon had the highest per capita Klan membership in the country, right? And the power of the Klan reached into the highest echelons at every point. So we see Walter Pierce as the Klan governor, right? And he worked with the Klan to push forward a lot of legislation, things like literacy tests, which we often think of as located in the South as these racist methods of keeping black folks from being able to vote. We had literacy tests here in Oregon, right? Things like the Compulsory Education Act, which focused on public schools, right? So this was at the time when institutions like public education, which shape all of our lives, were becoming solidified and codified. And they were becoming solidified and codified at a time when the Klan had immense power, right? In Portland, if I don't know if folks can see this picture, but there are a lot of men in suits posing with hooded Klansmen. In that picture is the Portland police chief, the district attorney, the U.S. attorney, the Multnomah County sheriff, and the Portland mayor, posing with hooded Klansmen under a headline that said that they were taking guidance from the Klan about what the Klan would like to see happen in Portland, right? So not only were they happy to meet with the Klan, they were happy to tell everyone in the newspaper that they were taking guidance and input from the Ku Klux Klan. And my theory is that Oregon is an incredibly useful case study for the rest of the nation because what happened in Oregon happened everywhere else. Oregon was often much more blatant, literally writing things down in black and white and reinforcing them again and again. But the same policies, practices, and ideologies that shaped Oregon shaped the rest of the nation. So we had Woodrow Wilson as the president, right? Woodrow Wilson wrote a pro-Klan history book. That pro-Klan history book became the basis for the novel The Klansman, which was the basis for the film Birth of a Nation. How many folks know what the film Birth of a Nation is? Okay. It is perhaps the most virulently racist film that's ever been created. It was also the first full-length film that was ever created. The point of Birth of a Nation is to glorify the Ku Klux Klan, and it portrays black folks after the Civil War as little more than animals and hordes that have to be controlled and maintained, and it portrays the Ku Klux Klan as white knights riding in to save the white South from these black hordes, right? Woodrow Wilson screened this film in the White House for visiting dignitaries, as if it were a documentary. It was, in fact, the first film that ever screened in the White House was Birth of a Nation. And he would show it and say, you know, black people whine about how we treat them around the world. This is why we have to treat them like this, because this is how they act, showing them this virulently racist film. And I think the other piece that's really important about this, that this slide particularly shows, is I always want to make sure that we are not framing communities of color and oppressed communities as passive victims, because they've always been active change makers, right? All of the racial advancements that have happened because of people of color, because of their determination, because of their courage, because of their resilience. And so Birth of a Nation was screening to sold-out crowds across this country, sold-out white crowds across this country, and the NAACP nationally, and as well as in Portland, staged protests every single time. And in fact, they ended up working hard enough in Portland that they successfully petitioned the city council to ban Birth of a Nation as a film from being shown in Portland. So again, communities of color in general and Black communities specifically have never been passive victims. They've been active change makers. Other pieces of this history that stood out to folks? I feel like there was a hand somewhere. Yes?
So I just wanted to clarify, by card carrying means they actually had identification cards.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes, literally card carrying. Other pieces of this history that were new to folks or stood out? Y'all were very talkative when I had y'all. I see y'all. Yes.
I noticed there were a couple laws that were unique or
Yes. Yes, thank you for that. So we have to answer the question, why aren't there more Black people? And don't watch it while I'm flipping because it'll make you seasick. I've done it to myself where I'm like, whoo, all right. So Oregon ended up having, so I met many Oregonians who are very free, that Oregon came into the Union a free state. I would never call Oregon a free state, right? Oregon did outlaw slavery while it was still a territory, but the same time that it outlawed slavery, it banned Black folks from living here, putting forth the first Black exclusion laws. And it included the lash law that said that Black people would be publicly whipped every 6 months, up to 39 lashes, until we left Oregon. So I would never call Oregon a free state, right? And I think that, to understand this, you have to understand Oregon was both anti-slavery and anti-Black. And that blows a lot of people's minds because we tell very simplistic racial myths around slavery and around the Civil War, right? So we tell these myths, if you were pro-slavery, you were bad. If you were anti-slavery, you were good. Pro-slavery is bad, not a myth. That's a fact. We're going to leave that. Bam, put a point on that. But anti-slavery is good has to be complicated, right? Because there were many reasons people were anti-slavery. So Black folks were anti-slavery for issues of freedom and justice, right? There were allies of color and white allies who were also anti-slavery because of issues of freedom and justice. But there were many more white folks in this country who were pro-slavery or who were fine with slavery continuing forever. And I think that's really important for us to remember because, again, we tell this racial myth, well, it was this small slave-owning class. The majority of folks thought slavery was bad. They knew it had to end. The majority of white Americans were fine with slavery continuing forever. Some of them were like, well, maybe slavery is a little harsh. Maybe we can reform it. Maybe we can make a kinder, gentler slavery, right? I think that's incredibly important for us to remember now when we're talking about institutional change, when we're talking about digging out the racism that has been built into the institutions that shape all of our lives, when we're talking about what kind of change is and is not possible. I think it's useful to say, in 150 years, what are those folks going to think when they look back on the institutions we have right now? Are they going to look back and say, didn't they all know that those things had to end? Why did it take them so long, right? Which side of history do we want to be on, right? So that piece is really important. But on the anti-slavery side, there were white folks who were both anti-slavery and anti-Black, right? Because for them, slavery was an economic issue. In the North, you had industrialization, right? Factories based on usually exploited immigrant labor. And in the South, you had a system of chattel slavery. They were in competition with one another, right? So the folks who owned those factories, the bosses, they didn't like slavery, right? But they didn't like slavery because it messed with their money. They were both anti-slavery and anti-Black. And you can go back and read propaganda aimed towards working class white folks that say things like, well, the reason, white working class folks, you can't get a job, the reason your pay is so low, you work under such unsafe conditions, under such long hours, it's not us, the bosses, the folks who own the factories, it's these enslaved Black folks. We can't compete with them. They are taking your jobs. Does that rhetoric maybe sound familiar past 1865? Right? I think that this is really important because we often talk about history as this linear progression towards greatness, which is absolutely false for many, many reasons. But I think that at best, history is a spiral, right? We can look down and say, we have had these conversations before. History is cyclical. We can use that to learn those lessons and to continue moving upwards. But if we don't, we'll just end up running around in circles, right? And so this is incredibly important because this is where Oregon was birthed as both anti-slavery and anti-Black, right? And the reason Oregon specifically was anti-slavery and anti-Black is because Oregon imagined itself as a white homeland. So the call went out, come to Oregon and build the sort of white society that you have dreamed of, away from the problems of the day, which was code words for the presence of people of color, right? And that's why we have, in 1850, we have the Oregon Donation Land Act that steals indigenous land and gives it away for free only to white folks. That is the foundation of Oregon, is literally the theft of indigenous land given away for free to white folks, right? That is the foundation of this racist white utopia that is Oregon. And also, when we say Oregon Territory, it's really important to remember Oregon Territory wasn't just Oregon. It was Oregon, it was Washington, Idaho, parts of Wyoming, parts of Montana, right? It was the Northwest. So when we say Oregon Territory told Black folks, you have to leave or we will physically torture you until you do, the entirety of the Northwest told Black folks that, right? So this mentality resulted in Oregon being the only state in the Union, as was mentioned, to be admitted with a racial exclusionary clause in its constitution. So Oregon's constitution had a Black exclusion law written into it. It banned Black folks from living in Oregon, from making contracts, from holding real estate. It basically criminalized Blackness. So if you were Black and in Oregon, you were a criminal. You didn't have to do anything other than be here and be Black to be seen as criminal, right? And Black folks had no legal standing. So they were undocumented people. And I think it's important to frame it like that because we are having these conversations again around immigrant justice, around who deserves access to basic human services, around who's even considered when we're talking about, about our communities. We've had those conversations before. And the last piece on this that's really important is that this language was in our Constitution until 2001. So until 2001, our Constitution included this Black exclusionary language. And this, to be clear, it wasn't an oversight, right? Like people make really silly excuses. Like, there's so much stuff in the Constitution, who could keep track of it all? I'm like, shouldn't you know what's in your founding document, A? But B, that is completely, false because the Black community actually came again and again and again to the legislature as well as to the ballot, and asked Oregon, please remove this language from the Constitution. Please tell us this is not the kind of place you want to live in. And again, Oregon left it in, reinforcing, actually, this is exactly the kind of place that we want to live in for over 100 years. And for anyone who was here in 2001, you remember it was a fight to get this language removed in 2001, in the 21st century, right? It had to go to ballot measure, and there was immense pushback. And most of the pushback centered around the idea of wanting to preserve Oregon's history, which many folks heard as wanting to preserve the history of this racist white utopia. I know you had your hand up a while ago. Right, and I think that's why it's important to talk about the founding idea that the Black exclusion laws are a manifestation of this idea of Oregon as a racist white utopia, but there are many other manifestations in different communities. So even though it was Black folks who were the only group that was excluded by law from Oregon, we see that the needs of this larger white community shape the communities of color, right? So indigenous folks, the land is taken and folks are forcibly and brutally moved, right? Forced to, in some cases, walk across the state by foot to go to, to the spaces that the larger society has deemed to be acceptable for them, right? We see with Asian communities specifically, we see, across this country, Chinese labor specifically being recruited to come and build the railroads, right? To do this incredibly unsafe, dangerous, toxic work. And then we see when the railroads are finished, very soon after, the federal government enacts the first Chinese exclusion law, right? To say, now that we have gotten what we need from you, you all have to go now, right? And we see that mentality brutally enforced in Oregon. So Chinese folks were lynched here in Oregon. An entire community was burned to the ground, and local authorities would not let that Chinese community rebuild. So 1,000 folks lost everything, including their community, and had to completely relocate, right? So even though the manifestations look different, and that's why I said it's important to learn these unique histories, they all come from this larger ideology of wanting to create a white homeland and using communities of color as tools, however that was needed for that larger idea. Is there another hand? I feel like I saw somebody's hand. Yes. Yes.
Is there any instances of that within Oregon where people would be against Oregon society that state
So it depends on what you consider to be records, right? And this shows the fallacy of how we consider history. So a lot of oral histories are not considered to be real history, right? So that's why you say some historians suggest this is the first documented, right? So this slide is the first well-documented person, right, documented according to Western white folks, because indigenous communities have stories from the 1500s and even before of black folks being in Oregon, right, and interacting, but because those are not considered legitimate sources by this sort of, Eurocentric history framework. So yes, there are many stories from indigenous communities of black folks living in those communities, right? Not necessarily documented by the larger society. But I think this slide is really important, right? Because how many folks have heard about York, who was enslaved by Clark? Right? How many folks have heard of Lewis and Clark? Yes, thank you. That's awesome. So I think this is like one of the few stories that comes through from Oregon Black history, and the ways that it is told is such a sanitized and completely ahistorical retelling that it actually makes it useless to us talking about it. And Dr. Daryl Milner, who actually I was lucky enough to have as a mentor and is one of the preeminent historians on this, he wrote a great article called York, I think it's a man of discovery, which it really is exploring the historical representations of York, who was enslaved by Clark. But the way the story is told is that, Clark came and brought York with him, and, as they forged through on this difficult, treacherous expedition, Clark, from the goodness of his heart, decided to accept York as an equal in this expedition. They even let him vote in a decision about where to make camp for the winter. And I've heard ad nauseum people say, this was the first time a black person voted in Oregon. And then, and so people are like, even the founding of Oregon was this, colorblind, post-racial in 1805 history. And again, like the Klan, none of that is true, right? So Clark forced York to come on this expedition because he was enslaved. York actually ended up becoming incredibly invaluable to the expedition because he's the only one that indigenous folks would trade with, right? So they were like, we don't know about those white folks, but you seem awesome, we will talk to you, right? He was the ambassador to indigenous tribes as they traveled the Lewis and Clark Trail, and they would have starved to death if not for York and his ability to engage and barter and trade, right? He also physically saved their lives numerous times. So Clark's shifting of allowing York the space is not because it was from the magnanimous goodness of his heart, it was because the situation called for that, right? Because without York, they would have died. But the minute they returned to the East Coast, Clark was like, all right, well, we're back to slave and slave owner, right? Even though he had promised to free York while they were on the expedition. And York was like, that's not what you said. And Clark called him insolent and sulky. He had him whipped. He had him jailed. He rented him out to a brutal slave master to break his spirit. And in a letter that Clark wrote to his cousin or his brother, he basically said, in flowerier language, York keeps whining that I said that I would free him. If he had done anything worthy of it, I would have, but he wasn't even that important on the expedition, right? So that is actually the real history of this. So even the tiniest bit we get is presented in such a way that we don't see these larger dynamics around white supremacy playing out. And it becomes almost useless to us. Right? I want to just give space for other folks, if there are other pieces that stood out to people in the history. Yes?
Would you say a little bit about the Oregon criminal justice system and Black people in Oregon?
I was like, can I say a little bit about it? I try to stay focused. So we're going to look at some current racial disparities. So maybe during that section we can bring it up and talk about it then. And if I forget, then be like, ahem, you can make that noise. So yes. Other pieces that stood out to folks?
For me, it wasn't like a lot, but it was a restaurant in Los Angeles, and
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this was the Coon Chicken Inn, and it was a chain restaurant, 3 different restaurants, and you entered through this incredibly racist caricature of a black face. But a restaurant with a similar history, Little Sambo's, which was originally titled Little Black Sambo's, and they just took out the black, that was the only concession they made, is still operating to this day. You can drive in Lincoln City. How many folks have seen Little Sambo? Yeah. Just down one of the main streets, and it's right there, and people are going in to have their brunch in a restaurant named for one of the most racist caricatures of black folks that's ever been created. And they're still operating and making a profit, so, yes?
I didn't see any mention of lunch counter attacks or protests. Did that happen in Oregon during the 1960s during the Civil Rights?
Yes. So Oregon has been long considered. Portland has been long considered to be the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line, right? So Portland, the most segregated city outside of the South, and I don't know that you have to take it outside of the South. So for well into the 20th century. Basically, the entire downtown Portland was closed to black folks, right? Black people couldn't eat, they couldn't get haircuts, they couldn't see a doctor. And that's actually why the first black communities rose up in Portland around the train station to address the needs of black folks who were coming through working on the railroads where there was nowhere else to get that made for them or to get that addressed. So there was organizing, around civil rights issues happening, led by the NAACP and the Urban League of Portland. Things like passing the Public Accommodations Act, which is specifically aimed at getting equal accommodations in any place, right? So any place that welcomes the public, right, which is what lunch counters and restaurants are. In 1953, because of the immense organizing work of the NAACP and the Urban League of Portland, this passed, right? They also passed a fair housing law in 1957. So the laws actually passed, in some cases, sooner than nationally, but then Oregon became very aware it's not just having the laws on the books, it's being able to enforce those laws, right? And that's where folks began taking different tactics of resistance. Another piece that stood out to folks or question you had? Yes?
The idea of sundown cities kind of like blew my mind of why.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that this is a really important piece. And this piece to me proves that Oregon is a useful case study for the rest of the nation. Because even though Oregon was the only one bold enough to write down a black exclusionary law when they were becoming a state, the same policies, practices, and ideologies that shaped Oregon shaped every state in the nation and shaped the nation as a whole. Because it's incredibly important to remember that America was founded as a racist white utopia. The founding principle of America is manifest destiny, right? Literally, the white colonizers who came said that God gave this land to white men to make it productive because indigenous people were not using it properly, and white men had the right to do whatever was necessary, including genocide, chattel slavery, massive thefts of land, to make it productive by God's will, right? That is literally almost a verbatim quote from the early colonizers. And so, that is the concept of a racist white utopia. So the same ideology that shaped Oregon is not unique, right? Folks often want to be like, oh, well, then Oregon is messed up. And I'm like, no, Oregon is messed up. But you're messed up as well. Not you personally, right? But where you live, obviously. Maybe that person. I don't know them. Anyway, so sundown towns is a way that we see this same ideology manifesting nationwide, right? The same ideology of a racist white utopia. Because sundown towns are purposely all white towns that are enforced by law, by custom, by violence, or by threat of violence, right? And I think that calling it, people often say sundown laws. That's not, I think, useful because it only shows part of the picture. Because then people say, well, sundown laws, they're inactive, right? They've been overruled by federal legislation changes and state legislation changes. So, we don't have any more sundown laws. We don't have sundown laws. We have sundown towns, right? So James Loewen, who's the preeminent historian around sundown towns, and he has a book called Sundown Towns, very hard to remember, I'm sure, has unfortunately documented thousands of sundown towns, many of them current to this day. So there are purposely all white towns across this nation that enforce that through violence, through threat of violence, and through custom, right? And I think James Loewen has a great quote in the introduction to his book where he says, if you enter into a space that is all white, that is not an accident. Someone, somewhere, deliberately and probably brutally created that situation to be all white. So if you are not seeing that happening now, know that that is the foundation of that all white space. And I think that that's a really important frame for folks because often people are like, I don't know, right? Like the title of my program, Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon? Folks try and be funny and they're like, I don't know, they don't like the rain. They didn't make it this far, right? All of these reasons, James Loewen is very clear. We see this history as a brutal reinforcement of this concept of a racist white utopia. And so if you're not seeing that enacted right now, A, that's a nice privilege to have, and B, you don't understand the foundation of it. So I think that this is important because this is something that existed and still exists nationally to this day. And the other piece that's really important is he talks about not only sundown towns, but sundown suburbs as well. Because the majority of suburbs were created as all-white communities, purposely all-white communities that kept out people of color through law, right? A lot of them have covenants written into their covenant that the only people of color who can be there are domestic servants, right? Through custom, through violence, through threat of violence. And so I think that's useful because oftentimes, again, we say, well, yeah, sundown towns, those are rural towns, those are working class towns, right? All of these very classist myths. The reality is sundown suburbs also exist to this day, right? And so they may manifest differently, but it is the same ideology that's in play and in operation. Right? Yes?
And I just kind of want to piggyback a little bit on what you were saying. as I told you earlier, I'm from Arkansas, and so I can truly tell you that at least there are several towns in Arkansas just like this, and it did come from the Northwest. Rogers, Arkansas is one of the towns where it is still a sundown town because it is one of the largest headquarters for the Western Sphere.
Yeah.
You know, where they have white people radio, et cetera, around that town and around that area. So this definitely was not unique to Oregon. It was just basically a starting point, and it does continue to this day.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that piece. So I want to, with the last little piece of this before we move on to kind of present day and connecting it, I want to talk about the kind of organizing and resistance, again, of the Black community. So we are not, and don't look at it, y'all. I told you not to look. I see some of y'all looking. Because again, the Black community have never been passive victims. They've been active change makers. And so 1867 was a huge year around education. So both Salem and Portland schools would not allow Black students in at all. So Black students could not go to school in Salem or in Portland up until 1867. And in Salem, the Black community raised $427.50, which was a lot of money in 1867, especially for folks who had no legal standing, right? They actually had no legal standing at this point. To start a school for their kids. And they ended up pressuring the Salem School District, who reluctantly took over the financial obligations after about 6 months. In Portland, William Brown actually threatened to sue Portland Public Schools before they very reluctantly started a segregated school to actually educate Black students. So up until this point, no Black students in Portland went to school, right? And I think that this, you know, again, obviously, I'm not like, yes, go second-class segregated schools. But the fact that folks without any legal standing were able to organize themselves and were courageous enough to organize themselves to put pressure on these institutions to gain better public access for everyone is incredibly important, right? I wanted to highlight Maxville, which was a logging community, not that far away. And there were 60 Black skilled workers and their families who went there and created community, which is incredibly powerful and amazing. And Gwen Trice, who is a daughter from the original families, has been working to research. She made a documentary with OPB called The Logger's Daughter, which you can watch all on online on OPB for free, and I encourage you to do so. It's an amazing documentary. And she's working to create a museum there to honor that legacy. And so I think that that connection of, you know, that this is not just history dead and past, but that there are folks who are part of that history, part of that legacy, working to preserve and protect it for all of us is incredibly important, right? So Portland was known as a jazz treasure nationally, which when I first heard, I was like, Portland, Oregon? Really? But folks from, you know, all of the greats played in Portland. Duke Ellington had his 54th or 56th birthday in Portland. He had a huge party. North Williams, which was the heart of the Albina neighborhood, you could hear jazz 24 hours a day. And I think that this is really important because, again, in a city that was considered to be the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line, in a community that was brutally segregated, right? Again, Albina was the only place Black folks were allowed to buy or rent, and that was brutally enforced. It was overcrowded, it was under-resourced, overexploited, right? Even within these oppressive conditions, that community was able to create cultures of resistance that spoke to everyone and everyone recognized as valuable. And the last example I want to talk about is the Black Panther Party. I actually forgot to tell you this. This is really cool. With the sundown towns. So if you go to the website, so just look up sundown towns. This will be the first site that comes up. It's James Lowen's site. This map is interactive. So if you click on this map, you can click on a state, and then it'll give you a list of cities and towns that they have evidence that they're sundown towns, and then you can read that evidence. So you can go and say, oh, is my city on that list? Last I checked, there were 25 Oregon cities, so probably. And it's a work in progress, so they're getting more information every day. So if you actually have evidence about sundown towns, you can submit it online, and then he's working with a team of grad students who research it and verify that information. So again, another way that this history is ongoing, and the work to preserve it is actually collective and communal, recognizing we all have pieces of this, right? But I want to talk about the Black Panther Party. In Oregon, there were 2 chapters, one in Eugene and one in Portland. There are many myths about the Black Panther Party that I don't necessarily have time to go into. Many folks may have seen the new documentary called The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, which aired on PBS, OPB. There's also a great documentary that's actually my favorite called All Power to the People. You can watch it online for free on YouTube right now. And so the number one thing that Panthers spent their time doing was working in programs called survival programs in the community, addressing the needs of that community. And so there were over 50 chapters internationally and locally of the Black Panther Party. Every single one of them was mandated to have one program, the Free Breakfast for Children program. Right? And in fact, the reason we have free and reduced lunch programs is because of the Black Panther Party. Because the Black Panther Party basically shamed the federal government into putting money into free and reduced lunch programs, because this organization that received no grant money, that received no federal funding, that was working on volunteers and donations, were feeding tens of thousands of children every day, right? And in fact, in 1969, the California treasurer said that the Black Panther Party fed more children every day than the United States government, right? Very soon after, we see the free and reduced lunch program starting directly because of the Black Panther Party. So the Portland chapter absolutely had a free breakfast program. Most chapters also had free health clinics. Portland had 2, both a general health clinic and a dental clinic. And all of the programs were open to everyone. So anyone who wanted to come and eat, anyone who wanted to get access to health services. I met many white folks who actually were like, you know, the Black Panther Party saved my life because I couldn't get health care service anywhere else. And I was able to get treated at the clinic. And the only thing they asked me was, what's wrong with me and how can we help fix you? They didn't ask for money, they didn't ask for anything, right? Completely free. So their dental clinic was one of the longest running clinics in Panther history. It ran for 10 years. And then Oregon Health Sciences University took it over. And it's actually still running to this day in Portland as a low-income dental clinic. So because of the Black Panther Party, this community has had access to, under the Black Panthers, free dental care, and under OHSU, low-income dental care for almost 50 years. Right? And I think this is a really important example because it shows that when we center the needs and the leadership of those folks who have been marginalized, they create community institutions that make all of our lives better, safer, and more whole. I think we often operate on the scarcity model where there's only so much, so if you get more, then that means I get less. But what we see is actually when the leadership of people who are marginalized and oppressed are taken, that it actually makes our entire community better and stronger, right? So I want to stop there on this piece because I want to give us time to actually connect this history to the current state around racial disparities. So one of the handouts that you got, hopefully, and if we don't have enough, you can pair up with someone who did get it for folks who didn't get a seat, is the State of Black Oregon 2015. This is a report that's put out by the Urban League of Portland, and the entire report is more than 100 pages long. You can download the whole thing as a PDF for free, or you can pay a nominal fee and get a hard copy from the Urban League of Portland. I encourage you to read the entirety of the report. But here I've just pulled out a few statistics that I think connect with this history and allow us to see the living legacy of this history. So what I'd love for folks to do is to just take a couple seconds to look over these statistics and then find a partner, maybe the same partner you had before, or a chance to make another new friend, whatever you would like, and say, what are the connections that you see between this history and these statistics? So what connections do you see between this history around race and the statistics around racial disparity today, right? What are those connections? Does that make sense to folks? So we're just going to take, 5 or so minutes, so just make a couple concrete connections with your partner. So find someone, pair up, and then we'll come back together. Oh. Sheets, if you need some. wrap up that thought.
Might be 5 times as many white stones.
So let's put a period on that sentence and come back to the larger group. That's like an ellipses and some semicolons. We want a hard period, y'all. Period. So I'd love to come back to the large group. I love that y'all are enjoying your conversations. I don't mind having to say that a bunch. So I would love if anybody wants to really quickly share one of the connections that folks made between the statistics. Yes?
My future career is an educator, and for the Oregon students to graduate on time, both percentages matter to me because I'm a future educator, but the fact that the Black percentage of Oregon students is like, why? Like, shouldn't they be, aren't we all supposed to be equal now? Isn't our education supposed to be equal? So just the overall percentage bothers me, that bothers me that not.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point, and that we can see the connections, right? I mean, that the that Salem and Portland school districts did not want to educate black children, that the black community actually forced them through a number of different mechanisms to educate black children. And we see that foundation continuing today, as well as with, again, when the Klan had power, they were passing legislation focused around education and around public education as well. And that's at a time when those institutions are being solidified. So I think that's really important. There's actually a great article called Desegregation and Multiculturalism in Portland Public Schools that talks a lot about the history, specifically in Portland, of schools and education, which has been quite rough, let's just say that. Other connections folks made? Yes?
We made a connection that like the trickle-down effect. If you don't have enough money to support your house, then you're going to obviously live below the poverty line, and you can't own your own house and send your education.
Absolutely. I think that's so important. All of these statistics are connected. And the number one way that wealth is created and passed down in America is home ownership, right? So the fact that black folks were systematically locked out of being able to buy their homes, right? The only place you could buy and rent was in Albina, and yet Albina, you could almost never get a loan to actually buy your house. So unless you could put down the full value of the house, you were going to be a renter, right? So not having that financial base results in this, this first statistic, the median net wealth nationally of households, that black households, it's not a typo. I've actually had many people come up and be like, you have a typo in your handout. I'm like, I wish it was a typo. That the median net worth of black families, black households nationally is $11,000. That the median net worth of white households is $141,900, right? Well over a $100,000 gap. And as you said, it's because all of these issues are intertwined, right? I think one statistic that, to talk about criminal legal systems, right, that when we look at the fact that black folks are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites, when we look at the ways that black youth are systematically targeted for Measure 11 crimes, we see the ways that this foundation in the idea of blackness as criminal continues to play out to this day, right? And that this is, again, a national ideology of the criminalization of blackness. Oregon was just bold enough to write it down and literally make black identity a criminal act. But we can see that this continues to this day, right? That the person who decides who gets charged with a Measure 11 account and who does not is a prosecutor. And a prosecutor is using the same racialized frames that all of us are given. When they are looking at a youth and deciding, do I charge this? Is this a youth who just made a mistake? Do I charge them that way? Or is this, someone who is a danger and a predator to the community and I charge them that way, right? And they are using the same racialized frames that all of us have been given and that have existed in this state and in this nation for hundreds of years, right? The last statistic that I really want to highlight that I think is incredibly important is the health statistic, that black babies in Oregon are 45% more likely to be born with low birth weight and 33% more likely to die as infants than white babies. This is incredibly important because a disparity between black and white birth weights and infant mortality exists regardless of the class of the mother. So often, we don't want to talk about race. We want to talk about class. It's easier, right? It's a class thing. We're all in this together. And we absolutely have to talk about class. And more importantly, we have to talk about the intersections of race and class and gender and sexual identity and nationality. But we have to talk about race because even wealthy black women's babies are more likely to die and be born with low birth weight than white babies, right? So this is not just about class. This is about race. It's about the racial trauma that lives in black folks' bodies and is literally killing the next generation. So there was, I don't know if folks saw this article, but they made changes to the DSM-5 to categorize racial trauma in the same category as PTSD from soldiers returning from war, right? That the everyday lived experience of being a person of color in this country gives you the same level of trauma as being in a war zone, right? That racial trauma is living in people's bodies and it is literally killing the next generation of black folks. So whether or not that black mother is wealthy, whether or not she has access to the best prenatal care, the best vitamins, the best organic foods, whether or not she sits on a yoga ball or whatever else you do, right? Her baby is still more likely to die than a white baby because she is black, right? So this shows that we have to talk about race, even though, you know, we don't know how to do it, we're not taught how to do it, we have to talk about race because it is literally killing black children as we speak, right? So to wrap up my section of it, I don't want to end there because that's rough. So the last thing I want to do is to turn to the other sheet that hopefully folks got, which says Organizations in Oregon Working on Racial Justice. So this is a list that I've been compiling for the 5 years that I've been traveling around of folks across the state who are doing work around racial justice issues. And the subtitle is A Work in Progress, because I ask every audience, as I'm asking you, if you know organizations in your community or anywhere in Oregon that are working on racial justice that are not on this list but should be, let me know, and then I will add them. So the next time they will be part of this list. I've actually already gotten like a dozen new organizations just from doing this tour. So I think that, you know, this list is really important because we don't hear about the on-the-ground organizing around racial justice that's happening, but it is happening. It's happening in every community in Oregon. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands of folks in this state working every day to enact racial justice. And there are a multitude of organizations and almost infinite ways to get involved in that work. So whatever level you're at, whatever your skill, whatever your interest, whatever your commitment, you can do something to work around racial justice and add yourself to this list. Right, not literally add yourself to the list, because that would be really awkward just to have your name with all these organizations. Figuratively add yourself to this list. So I want to make sure we stay on time so that you actually now have time to talk about, well, what does that mean here? Rather than just kind of staying theoretical, but saying, all right, on the ground, what does that mean? So I'm going to turn it over to folks here, and they're going to lead you through a conversation about the impact of this in your community and also what you can do in your community. So thank you all so much for having me, for coming out, for engaging. Thank you.